And the scripture reading I've chosen for this evening comes from the 3rd chapter of Exodus. And Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. And he looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I might turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said further, I am the God, your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So again, our series idea that the clergy chose as we were thinking about Lent for this year was the idea of sanctuary. And as we think of sanctuary, one of the first things that most people think of is this space, the place where people gather for worship. It's called a sanctuary. Actually, technically, everything on this side of the kneeling rail, this area is the sanctuary. If you were seeking sanctuary, safety, protection in a medieval church, you had to be on that side of that. The kneeling rail was actually not a kneeling rail. It was actually there to keep animals from going up onto the altar. And this section where we sit normally now is actually called the nave. And this sanctuary perfectly fits that. The same word from which we get navy, that sense that we're in this together, or rowing together, whatever it might be. Same sense of safety and security here in this place that we tend to call the entirety of the sanctuary. But what is it about this place, not just here, but any sanctuary in any church around the world, that makes it sacred, it makes it holy, that makes it safe for people? The Church of the Resurrection is the largest United Methodist church in the world, located in Leawood, Kansas, just outside of Kansas City. They have membership over 20,000, worship around 13,000 plus on any given weekends, have Saturday and Sunday worship services. And the first time I went to the Church of the Resurrection, I took a tour that they were offering around the buildings to look at all the ministries they were offering, all the services that they offered to the Kansas City community, just the operation of the church. But it was also sort of walking through their sanctuaries. And they have what they now call a chapel. It's probably a little bit bigger than our sanctuary is here. Seats maybe 250 or 300. That's just a guess on my part. And it is the original sanctuary for the church. They began in a funeral home when they got too big to be meeting there. Then they built their first sanctuary, and that's where they worship. But as they continued to grow, they had more people attending than could fit in that space. And so they built a building behind what had been their sanctuary, and that became now their new sanctuary. And where they had originally been worshipped became the entryway to their new sanctuary. So it was where they had their welcome desk and all that sort of information where people were coming into the building. So where they had been worshiping what had been sanctuary was now no longer holy space, quote unquote. It was a welcoming space, and people moved back into their new sanctuary. And they continued to grow, and they eventually outgrew their second sanctuary. And so they built a new building, a new sanctuary, which is their third sanctuary for the site. And they took what had been their second sanctuary, and they turned it into basketball courts, and they had a rock climbing wall, lots of other things became the youth space for the church. They still held worship there on Sunday for their contemporary worship service, so the original stage was still there for their praise band. But it was used for lots of other things during the week. And then what had become the entryway to that was again made a sanctuary, so they had a small space where they could gather and worship. Again, talking 300 people who are gathering and worship, but when you have several thousand who are gathered in the main sanctuary, 300 is a small space. So they took their entryway, what had been the original sanctuary, and turned it back into a worship space. And they kept growing, and they kept growing, and so they took their third sanctuary and decided it wasn't big enough anymore. And they now, I think a year and a half, 2 years ago, they opened up a new sanctuary, now their fourth space, which holds even more than their third sanctuary does, although it doesn't feel, it has a very intimate feel to it. It does not feel like there's several thousand people who are gathered around in worship with you. And then they took what had been their third worship space, their third sanctuary, and then they turned it into a conference space. Now they can have 1,000 or more people sitting around tables in that space, and if they're just in chairs, it can hold several thousand people still. And so what sort of struck me as I was going through on this tour is this sense of what makes a space holy? What makes a space sacred? What makes a space a sanctuary? Because what they had done is they had said, this original sanctuary, this is where we worship. This is our sacred space. And then they moved on, and it was no longer a sacred space per se. It was an entryway to move into a new sacred space, which then became basketball courts, right? And the new sacred space was their third sanctuary. And then they stopped using that as worship space, and now in another space. And so when they had been very clear from the beginning about the intentionality of space, they're saying this space is sacred for the moment, but this is where we worship, but we don't worship the space. Right? There was no sacred cows in it. I'm sure that there were people who complained when they moved on, but they understood what the mission of their church was, which was to reach unchurched and nominally churched Christians in the Kansas City area. So they said, our goal is to reach as many people as we possibly can. And so if this space doesn't do that mission anymore, then we leave it behind and we move on to do something else. But there were no sacred cows. They did not worship the space in which they gathered. And I know plenty of churches where if you move one thing out of place, you're going to get in trouble because that was so-and-so gave us that, or that chair has always been there, and you better not mess with my spots. That we no longer worship God in that space, we worship the space itself. And so again, we can ask the question, does that make it sacred, or is that now becoming unsacred space because we've forgotten the purpose of what it is? So what makes some place holy? What makes it sacred ground? That's what Moses does not expect to encounter God. He's out taking care of his father-in-law's flocks, and he goes to the mountain of God. But does he expect to encounter God there? Or is he just doing what he does every day, tending to these flocks? But then he sees that burning bush, and he's told, take off your sandals because you're now standing on holy ground. So is it the encounter with God that makes it holy? We see this throughout the Hebrew Scriptures of people encountering God, and then often we're told that they built an altar to God there, or they marked it in some other way. They built up stones, and there's still some name about the encounter that took place in this spot. So is it encountering God that makes a space holy? Because some people will say, well, I don't have to go to church because I can encounter God out in the wilderness. I go out hiking and I can encounter God. And that's certainly true. I'm not discounting that at all. But then we have to ask the question, is just encountering God what church is about? Or is there something more to that? Is there something more to this gathering of people in one space that also seems to make this space holy and sacred? Is it that makes this sanctuary? Is it where we have an expectation of encountering the sacred, encountering the divine? Because when we were talking about the expectations for membership of the church, and I talked about attendance as being one of them, and I said that one of the expectations that we should have when we come into this space is we should have the expectation that we will encounter God here in this place. And it may not happen every week. But every time we come into this space, we should be in the frame of mind and the expectation that God will be present here for us, and we will be present for God. So what makes a space sacred and holy? And I think that's an important question to ask in this time, in which, again, we're not sitting at Trinity on the Hill in worship with other people from other churches throughout the town. That I'm standing here by myself in this sanctuary. Can you worship by yourself? Jesus says, where two or more are gathered, there I am with you. And so as we think about how do we worship without being together, when we're sitting in our living rooms or a den or a bedroom, wherever it might be that you might be watching this, or you might gather on Sunday, what is it about that space that's holy? Or can it be holy space? Can it be sacred space? Can it be sanctuary? And I think it can be, if we're intentional about making it so. Because again, you can go out into the wilderness and you can encounter God, and you can go out there and not encounter God, and you can come into the sanctuary and not encounter God either. If you come in not expecting to meet God, thinking God is not going to be present for me this morning, more than likely you're going to be right. I mean, sometimes God will do amazing things and touch you in ways you never thought you were going to be touched. But you might have been closed off for that moment. But instead, God says, nope, I'm here for you. But I think we have to have some intentionality about our space in which we worship. And so in this time, in which we're thinking about worshiping more by ourselves than by others, of keeping our distance from others, what do we do to make our space holy? I think the first thing we do is we engage in prayer. That before you even turn on your phone or your computer, however it is that you're watching this service, that you stop and you begin to pray and you ask God to center you and to mark that time as holy and sacred, that you're about to do something important. And part of that is setting that expectation that you are going to encounter God. That God is going to be just as present for you in your living room as God is present for you here in this space. That that's going to be your sanctuary for that time. And then that also requires setting boundaries for the time. Saying for the next 20 minutes or for the next hour, whatever it might be for the length of service that we're doing, say that's what I'm going to be focused on. The same as coming in here, you're not, checking your phones, at least hopefully you're not checking your phones. You're not making your grocery list. You're not looking, seeing what the dog is doing or what that noise is that's happening across the streets. You're going to say, for this amount of time, this is what I'm focused on, and this is where I am focused in being. And then simply being present there. And again, the same thing should happen when you come into the sanctuary itself. All these same things should take place. And in doing those things, in worshiping God, regardless of where we are, we can make that space holy. And we can make that time sacred. And we can even make it sanctuary. But it's about the intentionality that we put into this. Because there's something important about sacred space. There's something important about knowing that there's a place where you can be safe, where you know that God will be present for you and you will be present with God. And I wrote in the letter I sent out a couple of weeks ago, when I was talking about, we don't know what's going on with worship, but there's something important about being here. There's something important about worship. And I said, when my 9-year-old nephew Wyatt had died, I went to church the next Sunday, the next day, in this case. I did not preach. I was not presiding that worship service. I had a retired clergy member who stepped up for me and took that service. But I went to worship because I had to be there. That And I needed to be in that space, to be present with God there, but I also needed to be present with the people who were there, my community, my church family. That there was something about that moment that I needed to be connected to something bigger than myself. And the same thing can happen even by yourself in your living room, that we know that others who are gathered with us, not just in Los Alamos or White Rock, but we had people who were in Albuquerque who were watching us. People are inviting their friends to watch, from around the world. I would encourage you to do the same thing. You can even do a watch party. You can invite people to watch that worship service with you and interchange in the comment section if you're watching it on Facebook, to know that you're connected even if you might be by yourself. And there's something holy and sacred in that. So as we get ready for worship this Sunday and for the Sunday following, and we'll see where we are for Easter Sunday, it might be that we are still doing this same thing, but you know what? The women went to the tomb alone. It was later that they gathered together. But someday we're going to be back in this sanctuary worshiping together. But in the meantime, we can have holy space. We can pray for it. We can set an expectation of encountering God. We can be present. We can set boundaries of respecting our time. We can make our own space holy and sacred. We can make it sanctuary. So I encourage you to do that. As we prepare for worship on Sunday, we'll complete the prayer paths of Jesus, looking at Jesus' prayer from the cross of forgiveness. So may we mark this time as sacred, not just as different, but mark it as well as holy, knowing that God is indeed with us wherever we are, and nothing in all of creation can separate us from God's love. I pray that it will be so, my brothers and sisters.